Hi, welcome to Tigress on Tuk-tuk. I'm Sarah Mohan, and as we reach the end of season 1, I thought to kind of go back to the beginning. Well, this is the penultimate episode, and the opposite end of that will be episode 2, which was a lovely introduction to urban wildlife. What it means, how you can welcome city wildlife to your compounds and communities, and why you ought not to run around with a shoe in hand smacking every living thing in sight. Let's see, that's what, why, how. Okay, so this week we're going to get into the who. Who exactly are these creatures? Fellow urban denizens that share city space with us? Of course, we are never going to get through even a quarter of the many species we find living in our cities, and of course, it is subject to where exactly in India you live. But these are stories of some of the most common creatures, some with really fascinating, quirky lifestyles, and some just because they're my favorite. So this is kind of like a sequel to episode 2, but where we actually talk about the who's who of urban wildlife. This idea happened because I was told to look up our guest for today, and I found his blog, which has a delightful, detailed collection of first-hand observations of so many critters. Some of them are forest dwellers or rare life forms, at least for us city folk. But most of his posts are on urban wildlife, and I felt like I'd fallen into a little book with story after story of the creatures I encounter all the time. I thought, why not do a giant audio story, like a collection of short stories on specific creatures through our guests' experiences? So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. You'll also hear me weaving in excerpts from some of his blog entries, which I've linked in the show notes, and you should check out. I caught up with our guest at his home in Bangalore, where he lives with his family. I found out that up until this interview, he'd never actually said yes to being on a podcast. But somehow, lucky me, lucky you, he agreed to Tigress on Tuk-tuk. Once we sat down, it felt like I was talking to someone I'd known a while. And later, him, his wife, and I went out to lunch and grabbed a pizza. And we had the best time. It's inexplicable how sometimes you just connect with people. He is a naturalist. It feels inadequate to call him just a naturalist. He's been doing it for decades and has contributed a great deal through all his work. In fact, he's the chief naturalist with jungle lodges and resorts and spends a lot of time in forests. He's also a photographer, an author who's published some fantastic field guides among countless other technical publications and articles. And he's the teller of many, many wonderful stories from nature. Here's naturalist, photographer, educator, and writer, incredibly generous with sharing his nature stories and life experiences, wild wanderer Karthikeyan Srinivasan.
Most people know me as Karthik. I've been into wildlife for the longest time that I can think of. I just can't write my intro. I never do that.
Okay, so if you could start by just sort of telling me how all of this started for you, just this entry into the natural world. Is it something that was like one of those, in that moment it happened, or was it something that just you got into gradually?
Well, I think it started off with one of my teachers in my high school saying you could go bird watching when you have free time, and that's how it started. But then as a kid, I really didn't care too much about bird watching. But somewhere along the line, another friend of mine and I decided to just hop onto our bikes and then cycle out of town and then see what this whole bird watching is all about. And we did go park our cycles, wander off into the shrubbery, and then we saw a few birds. We had no clue what the birds were.
How old were you?
I was probably 17 or 18
Okay.
or thereabouts, yeah.
Okay.
And that's how things started, and there's no looking back after that. We saw, like I said, we saw these birds, and then we were quite fascinated about what we saw, and the bug was there to stay.
Now, it so happened that around this time, Karthik's family also moved into a house with a large yard in the outskirts of Bangalore city, at least at that time. A whole new world opened up, for this is where he met many creatures who star on today's episode.
There was almost nothing around here, and our house was one of the very few houses in that locality. This place that we lived in, like I said, had a lot of open space, including an abandoned quarry which was filled with water with a lot of bulrush growing on it, which had formed a thick mat on the top. A light person could actually walk on this floating vegetation and get to the other side of the quarry.
Okay.
And there are times when we've seen cattle getting into it and getting stuck and not knowing how to get out. So there are a lot of birds around. We started seeing birds around the house, which we had never seen before. So I can attribute a lot of lifers to my that house that we lived in.
When one lives close to a water body, there's a whole variety of birds one gets to see. Of course, the water birds, storks, egrets, herons, and such, but also little rarities that live along the water's edge, hidden away in the tall grasses.
Lots of birds that I've seen there, including the white-necked stork, what is now called the woolly-necked stork. My first sighting of the streaked weavers also was there, and they are a very interesting species. They bring the bulrush together and the tips together, and then they build a nest inside there. So it's a very interesting.
So while the grass is still rooted, they just...
The bulrush, the typha rush,
tall.
which grows tall in all these water bodies, they bring the tips together and then they build a nest inside there. So that's a very interesting nest that they build. I've seen red munias, I've seen a whole lot of other munias, I've seen white-breasted water wrens, which would give me sleepless nights many a times because they have these loud raucous calls and often call in the night. So I would stay awake when the white-breasted water wrens would decide to call.
I would watch it as it went about finding food, venturing cautiously out of the tangle to the edge of the water. It could be seen walking about with measured steps. The erect tail twitching with each step was very characteristic. That's from his blog post, The Quarry Behind My House, where Karthik talks about various birds in great detail. The white-breasted water hen, as the name suggests, is a small, long-legged hen-like bird with a slaty-coloured tuxedo, a yellow beak tinged with orange, and is generally rather shy and runs off helter-skelter at the slightest movement of a shadow.
A lot of birding happened there.
Yeah.
Whenever I didn't have anything else to do, I would be sitting there with a pair of binoculars. Hupus were there. Rollers would be around.
Oh. They make the most bizarre sounds, don't they? When they do.
Yeah, but they're very beautiful birds all the same.
Yeah, absolutely. The Hupu and the Indian roller are two birds you're likely to find more in the suburbs, where there are bits of open, scrubby, grassy areas. People often mistake the Hupu for a woodpecker, named after its soft call. It has a downward curved black beak and a peach-pink tinged cinnamon-coloured body and a crest of black-tipped feathers. The roller is a bird of the wire. The next time you're on a road trip, keep your eyes peeled on the electric wire and you'll come across this stout shape, which at first might appear dull-coloured. But if you look closely enough, you'll spot feathers in breathtaking shades of blue. It has these loud, raucous calls, but only during the breeding season, which is kind of now, between March and June, when the males get up to all kinds of antics to get a mate's attention. Hardly ever a peep out of them the rest of the year. Another bird of the wire is the white-breasted kingfisher, a gorgeous electric blue creature with a thick orange bill, often found well away from water bodies and feeds on all manner of creatures, not just fish. I often hear its whirring, cackling call even on busy city streets.
You know, there are white-breasted kingfishers as well nesting there. The grey wagtails would come during the winters. So plenty of birds, including my first sighting of the pied cuckoo was at this quarry behind my house. So.
Oh, wow. Karthik spent a lot of time observing the nesting behavior of various birds. In one incredible account, he tells the story of the Ashiprinas, a small little bird that often, to me, sounds like a cat that swallowed another swaram.
Oh, the Ashiprinas are essentially warblers. They're pretty warblers, and the prinas are typically these long-tailed warblers which have their tails cocked up often. And I got to observe for almost 400 hours.
Wow.
Sat in front of the nest. I would sit inside the house with the window open, and the Ashiprinas would nest in the garden. So I could watch the whole thing from the time the first fiber was brought in to build the nest to the time the young ones fledged out of the nest.
Wow.
I would sort of keep tab of what they were doing by the minute, literally. And in fact, I used to weigh the egg soon after it was laid, and I would weigh the young ones every day.
Oh, wow. And
So
they weren't bothered by that?
the young ones fledged
Oh.
out of the nest. That really gave me a great opportunity to understand what happens with birds, what they do. Otherwise, typically people do want to see new species all the time, and you know that there is always a limit to that. Trying to understand common birds that you encounter frequently is a great way of enjoying and appreciating nature. And spending time with Ashiprinia did open a completely new dimension to bird watching for me. Yes.
Right. I've also noticed that in urban areas, at least in Chennai, this is what I see. You have a lot more of the miners and the roastering parakeets. Anything else that people can look out for, birds wise?
Well, there are barbets, the little ones like the Ashiprinas, the tailor birds, the sunbirds.
Okay, a bit on the coppersmith barbet. It's a small green bird with a bright blotch of crimson, yellow, and black around its head and throat. Now that summer is coming up, you're likely to hear this little bird call in the heat of the day far more than you're likely to spot it because they blend right into the trees. That call is like a nice mesmeric metronome, like a coppersmith striking metal, hence the bird's name. I sometimes like to think this bird sets the beat to which the rest of the bird orchestra perform. The tailor bird is a tiny tot, weighs under 10 grams, little speck of dull mossy green and a reddish crown. Again, very hard to spot, but my goodness, what a loud-ass call.
These are always there. The red-vented bulbuls are pretty much always there. Red-whiskered too, depending on where you are. Bangalore, I think, has predominance of red-whiskered bulbuls. They're always there. I mean, I have a pair of red-whiskered bulbuls which tried nesting on the bush just outside my window here.
Okay.
I had the spotted munias, what's known as the scaly-breasted munias now. I've seen them carrying nesting materials, though I haven't really gone looking for the nest per se. I'm worried about me finding the nest and other people wanting to also go and see it. So I've just sort of stayed away from
Good idea.
or kept my excitement at under control. So
Karthik's keen observation skills,
Deep curiosity about all life forms and ever-growing knowledge of the natural world has given him a career in conservation and environmental education.
for a long time, I used to work with WWF, and then a part of my work would take me to schools talking to children. We would conduct nature camps in the forests and stuff, but then the number of people that would be able to actually partake in all these camps were not a whole lot. So I realized that talking to people who don't get an opportunity to go out into the wild and telling them about things that they would probably never ever get to see, the chances that they would relate to you would be very less, or relate to even nature would be far less.
Yeah.
So I started talking to them about creatures that share the space with all of us in an urban landscape. That's how I started talking about urban wildlife. This was way back in I think mid 90s, 95, 96 or thereabouts. The problem, I think, also lies with the fact that people don't relate the term wildlife to an urban space.
Yeah.
So you also start talking to people about the word wildlife and its definition, to begin with. So once you've got that put in place, people start seeing wildlife, literally.
I've seen firsthand exactly what Karthik is talking about. Once people understand that there's wildlife walking, flying, crawling, living around them, it's like they've fallen down this rabbit hole into Wonderland. Suddenly, there's so much to see, so much to explore, and so many questions. And the biggest question askers, and my favorite, are the little people.
Children being children, they'd ask me questions like, how many species of this do you have? How many species of butterflies do you have? And I didn't have answers to these questions. And that's how I went on to doing this little book called The Fauna of Bangalore.
Wow. Okay.
which had a listing of reasonably comprehensive listing of all the vertebrates of Bangalore. Butterflies, of course, sneaked in because they were my favorite. So between these 6 taxa, we had more than 600 species listed in the book. So I was in a position to tell children, we have X number of species of this and that and all of that.
That book, Fauna of Bangalore, was perhaps the first of its kind for any Indian city. It took Karthik a couple of years and a lot of inputs from friends and colleagues to put it together. One of my favourite publications of Karthik's is this book called Avenue Trees of Bangalore. A handy little tree guide with great pictures and actually very relevant to almost any Indian city, not just Bangalore. And I love it because it's great for my tree classes with school children. This book just happened to happen. Karthik originally used to send out a group email with these little snippets on trees that he observed while walking to work through Cubbon Park. That turned into a little blog where he could now also include pictures, and he kept adding to the list. But then the folks on the email chain wanted more.
People said, no, we want this as a book. I said, look, it's available to you as a free download, so why do you want it as a book? It's very cumbersome to carry things around, of course. Smartphones were not in the way it is now. People would carry printouts of this whole thing, A4 size things. They would show it to me and say, look, this is very cumbersome to carry around. So they wanted it as a book. So this organization called EcoEdu, they came forward to publishing this book, and they said, if you're okay to allow us to put the content together, we would be happy to publish it. So they took the onus on themselves to publish this book.
And then came another similar book on garden climbers.
Also, the fact that when we did Avenue Trees, people said, oh, we live in an apartment, we can't grow trees. We said, fine, we'll give you something else to grow. So climbers came in, so people could grow even in a pot.
And now there's yet another book on Indian spiders coming out. The link to the website where you can purchase these books is in the show notes. Most of us urbanites probably can't name even 5 common trees, and that's where Karthik's lovely pictorial pocket guide can really help generate an interest. Because if you're not interested in the trees, we've got a problem.
Sure, it's great to notice birds and butterflies, but it would logically, to me, make more sense to start with the trees.
Indeed. So essentially this whole thing about trees started with me wanting the birders to start looking at other taxa as well. I did that with butterflies. When I started looking at butterflies, there weren't too many people looking at butterflies, at least as far as Bangalore went. And I got the birders to look at butterflies. They were anyways going out looking for birds, and butterflies were there too. So why not look at butterflies?
Yeah.
So maybe it may be preposterous if I said I can take credit for introducing people, butterfly watching to Bangalore, but well, in some sense, I think I did. So I thought people should also look at nature in a more holistic way than just looking at one taxa and not looking at other. That way, I think you start appreciating how things are interconnected and how they all work together.
Yeah, so trees form the bedrock on which all other biodiversity is built. So if you have a choice as to what trees to plant, choose wisely and choose native indigenous species.
Yeah, native plants definitely support a lot more diversity than exotics. That is a given, I guess. So it's good to encourage native plants, but it doesn't harm having a few exotics just to bring in a little more color and whatever else to an urban space. At the end of the day, the urban space is something that people are living in, and it's not entirely wrong to bring in a few exotics to add color and beauty to the landscape.
Okay, that's good to know. Not go guilty you about it.
Not necessary, because if you looked at a lot of, say, exotic trees, for instance, they do support good number of birds. Maybe if you looked at the African tulip tree, for instance, it produces a fair bit of nectar, and a lot of birds visit the tulip tree to have a meal of the nectar. They also provide space for roosting, also provide space for a lot of other creatures, smaller creatures like maybe the bark gecko, maybe, which would probably be seen on the tree trunks, or maybe the bark mantis. ants, all of these things do spend time on exotic trees. So, I mean, this is an argument which can go on.
Yeah.
There are pros and cons.
Yeah.
But as far as the urban space is concerned, I guess it should be okay to have a few exotics just to add color and vibrance to the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the African tulip tree with their flamboyant, flaming wine goblet flowers, most of the trees in our cities are non-natives, aka exotics, arrived here from a foreign land, mostly thanks to colonization. Take, for instance, the rain tree. Originally from Central and South America, a common sight in many Indian cities, growing along roadsides with a large, spreading, umbrella-shaped canopy providing plenty of shade. You've definitely seen this tree, with its delicate pink and white powder puff flowers which you'll find strewn under it, and its long, lumpy, slightly curved pods, each with a series of pill pockets filled with seeds and a sweet, sticky pulp that many creatures like squirrels love. It's uncertain why exactly it's called the rain tree, but I quite love the Tamil name for this tree. Tungamunji Maram, or sleepy-faced tree, thanks to the leaves closing up and drooping down every evening as the sun sets. Then there's the gulmohar. Again, so common across India, and right off the bat, I want to set the record straight. This is not the same as the flame of the forest tree. Lots of people confuse the two. The gulmohar is also called as the flame tree sometimes, and perhaps that's the confusion. But the flame of the forest, or the palash, is native to India and is a larger tree and not as common in urban areas as the gulmohar, which is originally from Madagascar and was planted in India and other parts of the world by the British, because they are suckers for pretty plants. An excerpt from Karthik's blog on this tree. Truly a spectacular tree when in bloom and otherwise too, owing to its large, flat, spreading canopy. The leaves are feathery and beautiful, particularly when young. The tree bursts into bloom with the onset of the hot season. So the flowers of this tree have 5 spatula-shaped petals, of which 4 are scarlet and sort of grow outwards like normal petals do, while the 5th one is upright and white, splotched with yellow and orange flecks. Now, if you're from my generation or older, you might have pulled apart one of these gulmohar buds, peeled a bit of the inner red lining, stuck them on your fingertips, and given yourself fake witch nails. The original nail extensions. Kids today really are missing out. The seeds of this one too are long green pods that turn brown as they ripen. So all these exotics have sort of naturalized over the years. They've gotten used to being in our ecosystem, and our native wildlife, for the most part, thrive on these trees. So then, what's the problem, you may say? Well, they haven't evolved here and so aren't fully used to our climate and weather patterns. Gulmohars, for example, uproot or break off easily in gusty weather. Happened in my garden. African tulips, trumpet trees, they all tend to be brittle and fall over or break in the monsoon. Native species are simply more climate resistant and better for overall ecological balance.
Do you think there are about a handful, like maybe 2 or 3 or 3 to 5 trees that you'd say are really great in terms of the value that they add to diversity? If you could pick a few and with the kinds of life that you'd see around it from your experiences.
Right, so I would probably want to go back to this little garden that I used to have. The whole garden was actually, to a large extent, planted by bats.
Huh.
Okay, so my dad brought in the banana plants. Those are the first big plants to come into that garden space. And once the banana plants established, the bats found it absolutely comfortable to sleep under the banana leaves.
Wow.
And they did a lot of planting in the garden. Right, so so much so that they brought in the polyalthea, the mast tree, and the mast tree then in turn brought in the tailed jay butterfly, which otherwise was not to be seen in my garden.
Oh, you've definitely seen the mast tree. It's just that loads of people get the name wrong. I was taught the wrong name too in school. What comes to mind when I say Ashoka tree? Are you thinking of a tall, towering column of a tree with those flouncy leaves and drooping branches? Yeah, that's not the Ashoka tree. That's the mast tree, or the false Ashoka tree, thanks to enough of us incorrectly calling it the Ashoka tree.
The bats also would fly about, feed on the curry leaf plant,
Okay.
They would again drop the seeds in my garden, and I had luxurious growth of curry leaf plants in my garden, and that brought in the common Mormon butterfly and the common lime butterflies. So I think having a few trees which will support a few organisms will then slowly bring in a whole lot of others. Maybe a fig tree to begin with. I guess it's a great thing to have if you have the space for it. And because fig trees do attract bats and a lot of birds which can fly long distances come to your space, and in the process they do disperse a lot of seeds, and you could be the beneficiary of that as well, like I was.
Do you think after the birds originally hooked you in, it was the butterflies that sort of really drew you in completely?
True. What would happen was on days that we were completely free, we would set off on our cycles, like I said, with some basic food thrown into our bags, and we would do birding till about 9:30, 10 in the morning, and then bird activity would sort of subside, and we were left with nothing to do until the evening. That's when this interest in butterflies started. You saw butterflies flitting about around the time when birds sort of quietened, and butterflies would be active till about 2:30, 3:30 in the afternoon, when the bird activity would again pick up. So it all fitted very well into a day's schedule.
Okay, now I promised you a whole entire episode on butterflies where we'll really get into them in detail. But let's talk about a handful of common species you're likely to see in most cities. You've most definitely seen this small, low-flying, bright yellow butterfly in grassy open areas. This is most likely one of the grass yellows. Then there's the tiger butterflies, the plain tiger and the striped. Both, of course, sport the colors of a tiger. People often think they are the famous monarch butterflies of North America. Same group, but completely different species. Now, Karthik was talking about the common Mormon and the lime butterfly. These are swallowtail butterflies, large, gorgeous creatures with tail extensions. The common Mormon is predominantly black-winged and bodied, with a row of white spots in case of the male. And if it's a female, then there could be a couple of versions, but you'll see a lot of red crescents on their wings as well. The lime butterfly does not have prominent tail extensions. It is also black, but what you'll mainly see on the upper side are irregular dull yellow bands and spots, and these two red dots at the base of its wings. The tailed jay is yet another black beauty with kind of triangular wings and these emerald green spots and bands on the upper side. The caterpillar feeds on the leaves of the mast tree, and when Karthik met this butterfly, it had just emerged from its pupa. So the type of butterflies you have around really depends on what kinds of plants you've got. The caterpillars have very specific palates, and adults have habitat preferences. So as the vegetation changes, so do the types of species.
From a clean 1200 square foot of land where we did a lot of kitchen gardening and stuff like that, to what it eventually went on to becoming, you walked into that garden, it was completely dark inside. So that is how dense the vegetation had become. And it was also a great opportunity to see how species change over a period of time. When it was open, we had things like yellow pansy, lemon pansy, blue pansies, all these sun-loving butterflies.
That's
right?
what we get in our
And
garden.
moment the whole place became shaded, the pansies were no longer to be seen. So again, depending on the plants that came in, or that the plants that you would put in, you would probably have things like your tail jays, your common limes, right? So the whole community of organisms which were to be seen in an open garden space changed to something else completely. It was quite interesting to see how one thing led to the other, and all these creatures slowly moved in to this little 1200 square foot of garden.
And you also had an experience with, I think, the Hawkmoth Caterpillar?
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a plant which was one of those few plants which we planted in the garden, primarily because my mother wanted flowers for her puja. And this was a Taberna montana plant that was there, and
That's the pinwheel flower or the crepe jasmine.
one afternoon I came out of my room, and then I saw cowcle calling, and then I was wondering why the cowcle was also making a slightly different call. It also makes a hiss kind of a call, the cowcle, apart from its booming call. I was curious as to why it was making this call. So I came out, I saw the cowcle, it got disturbed by my arrival, and then it flew away. Then I was just watching, standing out there in the balcony and looking, and I saw something move on the Tabernamentana plant. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't make out what was causing the movement. So I went and got my binocs and peered through my binoculars, and then I realized that there was a garden lizard which was trying to feed on something. And then I figured out what was happening. I got my camera out, and then I got picture of the garden lizard trying to feed on the Hawkmoth Caterpillar.
Nice.
Yeah, it was amazing to watch the whole thing, but unfortunately the lizard did not eat the caterpillar. It injured it, and then it left it halfway through and
Probably
then
didn't
went
like
away.
what it tried.
Possibly.
Yeah.
So the caterpillar neither became a moth nor meal. So
Unfortunate.
Hawk moths are a group of superflyers, very, very cool moths, and their caterpillars usually feed on plants that are toxic to most other creatures. These toxins accumulate in their bodies and deter predators from catching them. Probably why the garden lizard decided to quit when he still could.
Any other groups of creatures? I think you've mentioned things like reptiles as well that you'd experienced here.
yes, I mean, since it was fairly open landscape with shrubbery and stuff like that, snakes were plentiful. I would get called to rescue snakes. Yeah, would go pick them up, and my mother would be the one who would help me bag the snake.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she is somebody who's grown up with snakes, so she's very comfortable with them. In fact, she's caught snakes in my absence. So she is the one who would invariably hold the bag for me when I'm putting the snake inside the bag. So a lot of able-bodied young men around would keep their distance while my mother would hold the bag for me. So yeah, of course, the other lizards like your garden lizard and the rock agamas were plentiful. We would watch those as well.
So garden lizards being different to chameleons, of course. People often mix the two up.
Yes, the two are completely different creatures, yes.
Okay, so what most city folk commonly see around them is the Oriental garden lizard. They are not very large. Full-grown males would be over 30 centimeters or so. They're pretty fast and agile, and males have a prominent row of spines like a crest on their head and back. Males get a reddish-orange color on them, but only during the breeding season. Chameleons are slower. They have these large stereoscopic eyes and are the true masters of camouflage with great color-changing capabilities. Then, of course, there are the geckos, what people usually call lizards. I mean, they are lizards, but it wouldn't be right to call them that. They are geckos, and unlike other lizards, they have hundreds of minute hairs under their feet that help them go up walls vertically or hang out upside down on ceilings.
And there are a few varieties of them that we see
Yeah,
around.
quite a few varieties of species of geckos that we do get to see. The most often encountered would probably be what's often referred to as the Brooks gecko, which you hear them make a noise from the call that you hear. There are also other geckos depending on where you live. If you're particularly living on the outskirts of a city, there is a good chance that you will have a few other species of geckos coming into your house. If you're in a rocky area, then you are likely to have your rock geckos and stuff like that coming in. The more often encountered one would probably be a termite hill gecko when you are living on the outskirts of the city. And they're fairly big geckos compared to the usual ones that you see. And they're quite beautiful. They baby geckos of the termite hill gecko are really, really cute. They're chocolate brown with pretty yellow bands across their body. So very, very cute little things. I used to have a couple of these residing in my house. And all these, the geckos, I also used to have a couple of common tree frogs in my house. So all these, along with the giant crab spider, kept my house free of cockroaches.
An excerpt from Karthik's blog post titled Housekeeping Naturally, where he writes about his housemates who helped him stay on top of house cleaning chores. One morning, back indoors, I saw a brown blob on the kitchen counter. On closer examination, I figured that it was the mangled remains of a cockroach. The next morning, I saw something similar again. This led me to wonder as to who would have dealt with a cockroach in this fashion. A couple of days later, I woke up very early and spotted a large spider still holding on to a cockroach. Mystery solved. This arachnid must have found its way indoors from the garden.
Pollinators these days, I think people are getting a lot more, they're slightly more aware of what that means, pollinators, and what that extends to, and how they need to sort of look out for them a little bit. Yeah. You've had quite a few lovely stories with some of these bees specifically.
Right. I was introduced to the leafcutter bee to begin with, and like I said, we were in a fairly open space there, and we had doors with a typical bolt hole in it so that we could latch the door. And these were the target spaces for the leafcutter bees. So I would see these bees fly in and fly out and really didn't know what they were doing. But then, of course, I would make sure that the door was never closed, just to make sure whatever was going to be inside
didn't get squashed.
Wouldn't get squashed. So it was much later that I learned about leafcutter bees and all of that, and how they build these lovely long cigar-like structure with multiple cells, with each cell provisioned with food for the larvae that would come out of the eggs and stuff like that. They're amazing creatures. The way they are able to go cut leaves, such lovely circular leaves that they cut, is quite amazing to watch.
Yeah.
So leafcutter bees are kind of brown with darker bands. I mean, if you're new to bee watching, you'll know it's one if you see them flying off with a piece of cut leaf, or if you see perfectly scalloped edges from missing chunks on the leaves of some of your plants. The other bee Karthik has written about is the carpenter bee, and they come in a couple of varieties, but mostly they are large, black, curious bees, and people often think they are bumblebees. We don't got any bumblebees here in peninsular India, folks. Bumblebees only fly at altitudes of 2,000 to 15,000 feet in the Himalayas from Jammu Kashmir to Nagaland. So anywhere outside of that belt, you see a large black bumbling character buzzing around your head, it's a carpenter bee. And actually, they won't sting. They're very curious, so they'll come right at your head. But they won't sting as long as you've not invaded their nest, which hopefully you never do.
I spent almost 5 months sleeping with the carpenter bees, literally. In the sense that I lived in Yercaud for about 6 months, and I was living in a coffee estate workers' quarters, and the place had wooden rafters, and the wooden rafters had carpenter bees drilling into them, and they would make noise pretty much right through the night. And I'm a very light sleeper, and I would stay awake pretty much the whole night because these guys would go buzz and stuff like that through the night. So it was fun watching them, though they gave me sleepless nights. A lot of learning in the process.
Right, so they actually drill the holes themselves.
Yes, they drill. That's how they get the name carpenter bees. Carpenter bees are very interesting creatures. I mean, they are associated with your giant milkweed plant as well. And if you notice the structure of the flower of the giant milkweed in the calotropis, you will not see all the pollen and stuff like that sticking out. So that means that it requires a specialized pollinator to achieve pollination. And the one that pollinates the giant milkweed is a carpenter bee. So next time you ever see a giant milkweed, spend time with it. And you will see the carpenter bee come. When it lands on it, it will make a different sound. When it's flying, the frequency of the sound is different as compared to the frequency it makes when it lands on the flower. It's a very different frequency, and that sound is what releases the pollen out. Wow. This whole thing, a lot of flowers are buzz pollinated, as it is called. So carpenter bees do the same for the giant milkweed or the calotropis. Yeah.
And I think talking about, as you know, the pollinators per se extends also to the definition of pollinators, which we don't realize, also extends to wasps, which are usually just villainized to a great extent.
Yeah. Wasps, butterflies, they're all there doing their bit. They are all helping pollinate a whole lot of flowers and plants that we have.
Yeah, and wasps also are amazing architects, which you've got experiences of.
Yeah, the longest that I've ever observed wasp nest was during the last lockdown, the first lockdown due to the pandemic. And I spent several days sitting inside the house watching this mud dauber wasp building on the windowsill of my hall. There are several species of wasps which use mud to build these receptacles, but the one that I had using my hall was a very small one. It's black and yellow with a typical wasp waist, long slender waist. That's the wasp that built the pots in my house. And it was quite incredible to watch the way she went about bringing in pellets of mud. And I'm sure each pellet of mud that she would bring in would probably weigh as much as the adult wasp itself, or probably more.
Wow.
And going to a place, selecting mud of the right texture, making sure the consistency was right so that it was just about right for her to carry it back, and then making sure the mud was of the right texture to be able to mold it into a structure that she wanted. Was all quite amazing to watch, and I have written in great detail as to number of visits that they make. I mean, every 30 seconds she would go bring a pellet, add more layers to her little pot that she was making. They make these little pots to make sure they are able to provision for the young one as well. And one could see the adult wasp go bring spiders, paralyzed spiders, stuff it into the pot, lay an egg, seal it, and then go away.
Some days later, newly emerged, fully fed young ones fly out. What kick-ass mothers.
You know what? This is something that I've often wondered about, because it's something I saw so much of when I was growing up. And people have also asked this question. One thing that we don't see around too much are glowworms or fireflies. Wait, hang on. Is it fireflies or glowworms?
Well, both actually refer to the same creature. My first introduction to glowworms happened when, as a student, we would get together as friends and say we would do combined studies. But
Sure.
after some point of time in the night, when we couldn't concentrate.
Oh, this was a nighttime thing.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
We would step out of the house and wander around the street that we lived in, and we did get to see a few of these glowworms. And it was quite amazing, and these were my initial days into my forays into natural history, and I really didn't know what these things were, but eventually did get to learn about them. Glowworm is actually not a worm, and a firefly is not actually a fly. They are actually beetles.
Right.
The glowworm, I think in many cases it's a female which remains like a worm, never goes on to becoming becoming a winged adult.
Okay.
The fireflies are typically the males which go on to becoming adults with wings. So both are referring to beetles actually. Both glowworm and fireflies are both misnomers in that sense.
Right. And they're sort of using all of this just for communication, right?
Oh yes, communication and also deceit. Most glowworms and fireflies are using the light that they produce, which is incidentally the coldest form of light, to be able to communicate with each other, so that they are able to identify the members of the opposite sex and they don't make a mistake. But then there are species where the female imitates the flickering of light, the frequency of another male, of a male of another species, and then attracts it and makes a meal of them. So nature has worked out everything, everything that's possible.
Gruesome, right? Okay, so both the males and the I guess it varies up then. Will
Depends
be
on
able
the species.
to.
Yeah, both of them
light?
are able to produce light. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, coming back to this apartment, you've moved here some time back, and especially during the lockdown, in high-rise places like this one, what were some of the things that you witnessed and stood out to you?
Well, I think I started hearing birds more often than what I did before the lockdown. But this is also something which friends perhaps misconstrued as, birds have moved into Bangalore because of the lockdown and because there was less movement of people and stuff like that. But I would probably basically think that they started noticing birds which were always around.
Oh yeah.
Because of the silence, you heard them call. Now you heard it louder now. Otherwise, it was all drowned by the city sounds and things like that, traffic sounds and things like that. So I think it was more a figment of you getting an opportunity to noticing these things happening around you and appreciating it better than calling it that the birds moved into the city and
Right.
stuff like that because of the lockdown.
You know, this happened to me too. One evening, a few months into lockdown, I stopped dead in my tracks whilst out in my yard walking my dog, who was following me close behind and hence crashed right into me. All because suddenly, for the first time ever, I heard a red-vented bulbul. It took me a couple of more times until I spotted the bird right atop a mast tree across the road. Sadly, I don't hear the bulbul's grainy, bubbling song anymore. Maybe it's the crazy traffic sounds drowning them out. I'd rather that than the birds having up and left, now that the world is back on the hamster wheel again.
But then it also gave me an opportunity to, just look out of my window and observe birds like the house swifts. I think they've changed the name to little swifts now. The house swifts and the dusky crag martins, which have started using high-rise buildings in the city now.
Oh wow.
And in
Okay.
fact, a friend of mine happened to report the presence of Shaheen falcon. This, of course, she had reported a few years ago, and she's been seeing them regularly around her apartment complex. So it just shows how nature can move into the city as long as we are able to accommodate them. And all the high-rise buildings are imitating your rocky ledges, which is where your blue rock pigeons would love to live in under natural
Ah,
conditions.
yeah, many
Dusty
of
crag
those.
martins, house swifts, Shaheen falcons, all these are birds which are typical of rocky areas, rocky cliffs. They find the apartment buildings just right for their purpose, so they moved in.
And I feel like you can make that happen regardless of what that space is, right?
True.
Yeah, even if it's just your balcony, I've seen it change. So we just had an open, bare balcony, nothing. And then, like, pot by pot,
Sure.
it's just
Things
made
slowly.
such a difference.
I know of people who have had the red pyro butterfly visiting fourth floor and fifth floor homes,
Wow.
balconies. It's a tiny, frail butterfly. They must have planted kalancho in one of their pots, and the butterfly found its way all the way up to fourth floor or fifth floor. It also boils down to how much you understand things around you, the creatures that share the space with you, and therefore you are able to be a little more accommodative of their presence rather than indulge in wanton killings. Otherwise, the moment you see one of these things, I've written about this as well, about the long-tailed tree mouse, which came into my house and spent a whole week in my room, and it didn't do anything that a typical rodent would do.
Huh.
Right? So that's exactly what I'm trying to say. The moment you see anything long and tubular and you know it's a snake, you assume that it's a venomous snake. Right? It need not be. The moment you see a rodent, you expect it to chew up stuff, which they probably don't. So it all boils down to how much you are able to understand the organisms that share the space with you. And believe me, having all these creatures in your vicinity can make life a lot more interesting.
Oh, yeah, for sure. What would you say in terms of tools, techniques, or things that people can start doing in urban spaces once they get going, once they start noticing? Are there any sort of tips and tricks that you'd like to give to people or suggest?
Well, very often people associate natural history with a lot of gadgetry and all of those things, but I don't think that is necessary. To begin with, when I started my journey into this whole space of natural history, I didn't even have access to a pair of binoculars. Those days, binoculars were very difficult to come by, and they were also expensive piece of equipment to get. So the first few years of my birding happened without a pair of binoculars, which I think helped me hone my skills to a larger extent. We just used our eyes, and we started appreciating a lot of other aspects of a bird that you otherwise would have missed. the flight pattern, for instance, the posture of the bird, for instance. These are all things which help you identify birds better rather than just looking at color, which is what you would do largely when you're peering at a bird through a pair of binoculars, right?
I agree with Karthik. I didn't have a good pair of binoculars until a few years ago. I mean, binocs do really take your nature experience to the next level, but not having one has really helped me know general shape and form of creatures like common urban birds.
I think for people who don't want to maintain notes, today I think there are several platforms, citizen science platforms, where you can contribute and also make sure whatever you have documented stays somewhere, and also helping some research or whatever that's happening around. So I guess today you don't really need to worry too much about gadgets and stuff like that. One smartphone pretty much does all of that. The most important thing, the whole process, is to be able to find time and be able to spend time in the outdoors and observing these things. Even within the house, curiosity is what I think is lacking. People are in this big rush to know everything overnight. And I don't think that can happen when you're dealing with nature. You need to give it time. You need to spend time observing. You need to try and make sense of what is happening around you. And the moment you see something that you've been wanting to see for a long time, I mean, the thrill that you experience at that moment is something else. It was amazing to watch all these things happen, and these are things that stay with you for a long time. And experiencing natural history is not just about seeing something out there. It also, if you have to understand what's happening, you also need to come back and read about these things, try and do your little research about these things. So it's not just a one-off incident. So these are experiences which sort of stay with you, help you learn, understand things over a period of time.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I know this was a totally unexpected one-off, and if there are more of these recorded conversations that you do, I'll still have the thing of saying I was first.
Yes, you indeed were the first. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Pleasure
Karthik.
is mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you haven't yet, I hope you guys meet a leafcutter bee buzzing off with a piece of rolled up leaf under her belly, or hear the tinny call of a barbet this summer, or notice any of the creatures we've talked about today, for they're all around and up to you to discover. For lots more stories, go check out Karthik's journal, which is his blog at wildwanderer.com. You can follow him on Instagram at Karthik_wildwanderer. That's KARTHIK_wildwanderer. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter at Tigress on Tuk-tuk. Leave your reviews and ratings, please. I'll be back next week with the last episode of season 1. All right, I'm gonna go check out a new mud dauber wasp nest on my bathroom windowsill. You peeps be good peeps. Over and out.